Imagine the absolute terror of this moment. You are at a secluded restaurant saying goodbye to your secret lover. You think you're safe. You think you're finally closing a messy chapter of your life. And then you look up. Standing right at your table isn't a stranger, it's your husband. And he isn't screaming, he isn't making a scene. He is smiling and he politely asks to join you for dinner. This is the story of Camille, a woman who felt like a piece of furniture in her own perfect marriage, and Julian, the architect husband who designed her life but forgot to live in it. If you love stories about complex relationships, hidden secrets, and the heavy price of freedom, please hit subscribe and stay with me. Tonight, dinner is served, but the menu is strictly betrayal. Let's begin.
The crystal flute of vintage champagne hovered halfway to Camille's lips when the air in the restaurant shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden terrifying drop in atmospheric pressure that made the hairs on her arms stand up. Across the table, Lucas was laughing, a soft, carefree sound that belonged to a world she was borrowing time in, but Camille wasn't listening. Her gaze had locked onto the figure standing at the hostess stand, shaking rain off a black trench coat. Julian. Her husband wasn't supposed to be in Boston. He was supposed to be on a flight to London. But there he was, scanning the room with the predatory precision of a hawk, until his eyes stopped freezing her very blood right on her table. If you believe that the most dangerous storms are the silent ones, and that the hardest truths are revealed not in screams but in whispers, stay with me. This is the story of a perfect marriage, a perfect lie, and the dinner that burned it all down. The rain against the window pane of the Archer Hotel's dining room looked like static, a gray interference blurring the lights of Boston. Inside, the air smelled of truffle oil, expensive perfume, and for Camille Beaumont, impending ruin. "You're not listening," Lucas said, his voice dropping to that husky register that usually made her knees weak. He reached across the white tablecloth, his fingers brushing against her knuckles. "I said I don't care about the advance. I care about what you think of the ending." Camille pulled her hand back ostensibly to pick up her wine glass, but really to break the contact. The vintage Pinot Noir trembled slightly in the crystal. "Lucas, we talked about this. Public displays. We're in a corner booth, Cammy. No one knows us here. It's the Archer." Lucas smiled, that boyish, invincible smile of a 26-year-old who believed the world was a story he was writing. "Besides, you look beautiful in that light. You look free." Free. The word tasted like ash. She wasn't free. She was a thief stealing minutes from a life that had been contractually sealed 8 years ago in front of 300 guests at the public library. Tonight was supposed to be the end. The final chapter. She had the speech rehearsed in her head, gentle, firm, necessary. "I love you, but I can't do this anymore. Julian comes back from London tomorrow." "Lucas, listen." She started, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "We need to." She stopped. The breath trapped in her throat turned into a solid block of ice. 30 feet away, near the heavy velvet curtains of the entrance, a man was handing his wet trench coat to the maitre d'. He moved with a specific economy of motion, a precise, confident grace that she knew as well as her own reflection. He wore a charcoal suit tailored to the millimeter, and he was brushing rain from his shoulder with a gloved hand. Julian. The world tilted on its axis. The ambient jazz, the clinking of silverware. Lucas's voice, it all warped into a low buzzing hum. "London," her mind screamed. "He is in London. He texted me from the Heathrow lounge 6 hours ago. But he wasn't in London. He was here. In Boston. In her secret sanctuary." As if he could hear her internal scream, Julian turned. His gaze didn't sweep the room randomly. It was a laser cutting through the dim lighting, bypassing the other diners, and landing directly on her eyes. There was no surprise on his face, no shock, no confusion. He adjusted his cufflinks, thanked the host, and began to walk toward them. "Cammy," Lucas asked, frowning, as he saw the blood drain from her face. "What is it?" "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Don't turn around," Camille whispered, her lips barely moving. The terror was a physical weight crushing her lungs. "Oh God, don't turn around." But the footsteps were audible now. Click, click, click. The sound of leather on marble, steady as a metronome counting down to an explosion. Julian didn't rush. He walked with the leisurely pace of a man inspecting a property he owned. He stopped at their table, towering over them. The shadow he cast seemed to swallow the candlelight between Camille and Lucas. Camille couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She stared up at her husband, waiting for the shout, the accusation, the scene that would end her social life. Instead, Julian smiled. It was his boardroom smile, cold, sharp, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Camille," Julian said, his voice smooth as silk wrapped around a razor blade. "I didn't realize you enjoyed the risotto here. You usually find it too heavy." He shifted his gaze to Lucas, who was looking between them with dawning horror. Julian extended a hand perfectly manicured. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Julian St. James." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was agonizing. Her husband. Camille closed her eyes, wishing the floor would open up and swallow her whole. But the floor remained solid, and the nightmare was just beginning. "Do you mind if I join you?" Julian asked, pulling out the empty chair between them before anyone could answer. "I'm famished. The flight from London was cancelled." 6 months earlier, the silence in the Hartwell publishing offices was not terrifying. It was seductive. It was a silence Camille controlled, unlike the silence in her brownstone on Beacon Hill, which felt like a judgment. It was 8:00 p.m. on a Tuesday. The city outside was a blurred watercolor of gray and neon, but inside Camille's office the world was reduced to the soft hum of the HVAC and the scratch of her red pen against paper. "You're bleeding all over my protagonist," a voice said from the doorway. Camille didn't jump. She finished her correction, a comma splice that offended her sense of order, before looking up. Lucas Scott stood leaning against the doorframe, holding 2 paper cups of cheap coffee. He looked like everything Julian was not: unpolished, frantic, and vibrating with an energy that made the air around him feel warmer. His hair was a mess of dark curls, his flannel shirt was buttoned wrong, and his eyes were wide with the anxiety of a debut author. "Your protagonist talks too much," Camille said, removing her reading glasses. "He explains his feelings instead of feeling them. It's inefficient." Lucas walked in, kicking the door shut with his sneaker. He placed a coffee on her desk, right on top of a coaster. Julian would have checked the coaster for dust first. Lucas didn't even notice it. "Inefficient," Lucas repeated, sinking into the leather chair opposite her. "That's a word for architecture, Camille, not for love. Love is supposed to be messy. It's supposed to be a waste of time. That's why it's a luxury." Camille stiffened. Architecture. The word pricked her. Earlier that evening, she had called Julian to tell him she would be late. He hadn't asked why. He had simply reminded her to pick up his dry cleaning on the way home because the gala was on Thursday. He spoke to her like she was a project manager, not a partner. "I am editing a manuscript, Lucas, not debating philosophy," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. She took a sip of the coffee. It was sugary, milky, and terrible. She hated it. She took another sip. "You're unhappy," Lucas said. It wasn't a question. Camille lowered the cup. I beg your pardon. In chapter 4. Lucas pointed to the stack of papers. You cut the scene where the woman cries in the bathroom. You wrote melodramatic in the margin. But it's not melodrama, Camille. She's lonely. She's surrounded by people who admire her, but nobody knows her. You cut it because it made you uncomfortable. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. Camille looked at this boy, this 26-year-old, with ink stains on his fingers, and felt a wall inside her crumble. He had read her edits, but he had analyzed her. You don't know me, she whispered, a defensive reflex. I watch you, Lucas said softly. The playfulness was gone. I see you at the launch parties. You stand next to your husband like you're holding your breath. You look like a statue that wishes it could break. He reached across the desk. It was a brazen, reckless move. His hand hovered over hers, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. In her world, Julian's world, intimacy was scheduled, precise, and conducted in the dark. This was raw. Camille should have pulled away. She should have fired him. She should have gone home to the silent brownstone and the cold sheets. Instead, she looked at his hand, then up into his eyes. For the first time in years, the mask slipped. She let out a breath she felt like she had been holding since her wedding day. It's not melodrama, she admitted, her voice trembling. It's grief. Lucas didn't smile. He simply lowered his hand, his fingers brushing against her wrist, finding her pulse. It was racing. Then let's write it back in, he said. That was the moment. Not a kiss, not a grand declaration. Just a permission to be broken. The spark didn't come from the friction of bodies, but from the terrifying realization that a stranger understood her better than the man she shared a life with. And in that quiet office, amidst the smell of bad coffee and ink, Camille Beaumont made the first choice that would lead her to a rainy night at the Archer Hotel.
Hold on. Let me pause here for a moment, because this is crucial. Lucas didn't seduce her with flowers or compliments about her beauty. He seduced her by seeing her pain. When he told her that her editing was too raw, he was basically looking past her perfect mask. That is dangerous. Sometimes being truly understood is way more addictive than physical intimacy, don't you think? I have to ask, do you think emotional intimacy counts as cheating even before anything physical happens?
Julian settled into the chair with the fluid grace of a man who owned not just the furniture, but the space around it. He didn't look at Camille. He didn't look at Lucas. He looked at the waiter who had materialized instantly at his elbow, sensing the shift in the room's hierarchy. Good evening, Mr. St. James, the waiter murmured, his eyes darting nervously to the third setting he was hastily arranging. We weren't expecting you tonight. Spontaneity is the spice of life, isn't it? Julian said, unbuttoning his suit jacket. Under the ambient light, the charcoal fabric absorbed the glow, making him look like a black hole in the center of their universe. We'll skip the menus. My wife will have the Dover sole deboned. She hates the mess of bones. Camille's hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her nails bit into her palms. She hadn't ordered Dover sole in 5 years. She hated it. It was bland, safe, and colorless, exactly how Julian preferred her. And for the gentleman, Julian turned his gaze to Lucas, his eyes sweeping over the younger man's fraying collar and the ink stain on his thumb. Something robust, the ribeye, rare. He looks like he needs the protein. Lucas stiffened, his jaw set in a line of defiance that looked heartbreakingly fragile against Julian's granite composure. I can order for myself, Lucas said, his voice struggling to find traction. Of course you can. Julian smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. It was a facial reflex, nothing more. but I wouldn't recommend it. The kitchen here answers to me." He waved the waiter away with a flick of his wrist. Silence descended like a heavy curtain. The air in the booth felt recycled, too thin to support 3 pairs of lungs. Camille stared at the water condensation on her glass, praying for a fire alarm, a power outage, anything to break the circuit. "So," Julian said, unfolding his napkin and placing it across his lap. "Lucas Scott. The name sounds familiar. Camille mentions her work so rarely at home. She likes to keep her passions separate." He let the word passions hang in the air, inspecting it like a specimen under a microscope. "I'm a writer," Lucas said. He sat up straighter, trying to reclaim some physical space. "Camille is editing my novel." "Ah, yes. The novel," Julian nodded, picking up his water glass. "The one about the architect who builds a glass house he can't live in. Isn't that the premise?" Camille's heart stopped. That wasn't the premise. Not of the current draft. That was a metaphor Lucas had used in an email. A private email sent 3 months ago at 2:00 a.m. A metaphor about her marriage. She looked up, her eyes wide with terror, meeting Julian's gaze. For a second, the mask slipped. She saw something behind his calm facade, a deep, ancient malice. He knew. He wasn't guessing. He was quoting. "It's a metaphor," Lucas said, oblivious to the specific violation, thinking Julian was just being condescending. "It's about emotional sterility." "Emotional sterility," Julian repeated, tasting the phrase. "Fascinating. You know, in my line of work, Lucas, we don't deal in metaphors. We deal in load-bearing structures. If a column is weak, we don't write a poem about it. We remove it. We replace it before it brings the whole ceiling down on our heads." He leaned forward slightly, invading Lucas's personal space without moving his chair. "Tell me," Julian asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "In your book, does the glass house shatter? Or does the architect simply lock the door and leave the inhabitants to suffocate?" Lucas blinked, confused by the sudden intensity. I haven't written the ending yet." "Pity," Julian said, leaning back as the appetizers arrived. "Endings are the only part that matter. Anyone can start a fire, Mr. Scott. It takes a man to stand in the ashes." He picked up his fork and knife, the metal scraping softly against the china. "Eat," he commanded gently, looking at Camille's pale face. "You look like you're about to faint, darling, and we have a long meal ahead of us." The silence in the restaurant was suffocating, but it was nothing compared to the silence of the brownstone on Beacon Hill. Camille's mind drifted back to a night 8 months ago, the night the glass house actually cracked, long before Lucas Scott ever walked into her office. It was their 7th anniversary. The St. James townhouse was a masterpiece of modern preservation. Every surface was marble mahogany or polished steel. It was breathtakingly beautiful and clinically cold. That evening, Camille had dressed in the emerald silk gown Julian had selected for her. She had waited in the foyer, the grandfather clock marking the passing of time like a slow, deliberate gavel. 7 o'clock. 8 o'clock. 9. When the heavy front door finally opened at 9:30 p.m., Julian didn't carry flowers. He carried a roll of blueprints. "You're still up?" he had said, shaking off his coat, barely glancing at the woman who had spent 2 hours curling her hair. "I'm sorry, Camille. The zoning committee for the Seaport project is a nightmare. I had to stay." He walked past her, heading straight for his study. No kiss. No happy anniversary. "Julian," Camille had called out, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "It's the 12th. He paused at the door of his study, turning slowly. For a moment, she saw a flicker of recognition, perhaps even guilt, but he smoothed it over instantly with that terrifying pragmatism. "I know," he said. "The gift is on the credenza. My assistant picked it up this morning." Camille looked at the small velvet box sitting on the entry table. Inside was a diamond tennis bracelet. It was exquisite, expensive, and identical to the one he had given her 2 years ago. He hadn't even checked. He had simply automated his affection. "I don't want the bracelet," she had whispered, the silk of her dress suddenly feeling like a shroud. "I wanted dinner. I wanted us." Julian sighed, the sound of a man dealing with a slightly malfunctioning appliance. He walked back to her, taking her shoulders in his hands. His touch was firm, possessive, but devoid of heat. "Camille, we are building a legacy," he said, his eyes scanning her face, not with love, but with assessment. "The Seaport Tower will stand for 100 years. That requires sacrifice. You have a comfortable life. You have a name that opens every door in Boston. Don't be ungrateful. It's unbecoming." He kissed her forehead, a dry, perfunctory press of lips, and went into his study, closing the door. The lock clicked. That click was the sound of her marriage dying. Camille had stood there in the foyer, realizing she wasn't a partner. She was a curator of his existence. She was there to ensure his home looked lived in. His social calendar was managed, and his image remained untarnished. She was a load-bearing wall essential for the structure to stand, but destined to be covered up and ignored. Later that night, lying in the king-sized bed, listening to the rhythmic breathing of a husband who hadn't touched her in months, Camille didn't cry. She stared at the ceiling and realized she was starving. Not for sex, though the physical rejection stung, but for evidence that she existed. That was the drift. It wasn't a sudden storm. It was the slow, agonizing calcification of her heart. When she met Lucas 2 months later, she hadn't been looking for a replacement for Julian. She had been looking for a mirror. Someone to look at her and see a woman, not an asset. Someone who would notice if she changed her perfume, or if she was sad, or if she simply wanted to talk about a book ending without being told it was inefficient. Julian called it betrayal. Camille, in the dark recesses of her mind, called it survival. The arrival of the main course brought a momentary clattering distraction. The waiter placed the deboned Dover sole in front of Camille and a massive bleeding ribeye before Lucas. For Julian, a rack of lamb arranged with geometric precision. "Please," Julian said, picking up his steak knife. The silver glinted under the low chandelier. "Don't let it get cold." Lucas stared at the meat. He looked like a man who had suddenly forgotten how to use a fork. He picked up his knife, his hand trembling slightly, a weakness Julian noted with a microscopic quirk of his eyebrow. "You know, Lucas," Julian began slicing into his lamb with surgical exactitude. "I was reading a study recently about the integrity of historical renovations. It's quite applicable to many aspects of life." Camille felt the bile rise in her throat. She tried to speak, to derail the train before it crashed. "Julian, please. Not work. Not tonight." "Nonsense, darling. Lucas is a writer. He appreciates allegory." Julian didn't look up from his plate. "The study argued that when you introduce a foreign element into an established structure, say a cheap modern beam into a Victorian foundation, it doesn't support the house. It parasitizes it." Lucas stopped cutting. He put his knife down. The boyish charm was gone, replaced by the hard realization of a prey animal sensing the trap. "Are you calling me a parasite, Mr. St. James?" Lucas asked. His voice was quiet, but it held a tremor of bravery that made Camille's heart ache. Julian finally looked up. His eyes were flat, dead things. "I'm talking about architecture, Lucas. Why would you assume otherwise?" He took a sip of his wine, savoring the bouquet. "But since you bring it up, Foreign elements are often charming. They provide a contrast, a distraction, but they lack the resources to maintain the structure. Julian reached into his jacket pocket. For a terrifying second, Camille thought he was reaching for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a slim silver money clip and placed it on the table. It wasn't money. It was a receipt. I noticed your apartment building in Alston has had 3 code violations this month, Julian said casually, as if discussing the weather. The heating system is failing. It must be very cold at night. Is that why you spend so much time in my wife's office, for the warmth? Camille gasped. The air left her lungs. Julian, stop. And your student loans. Julian continued, ignoring her, his gaze locking onto Lucas. Defaulted twice. That's a heavy burden for a free spirit. It's hard to be a romantic hero when you can't afford the heating bill. Lucas's face flushed a deep, humiliating crimson. Julian was stripping him naked right there in the middle of the restaurant. He wasn't attacking Lucas's love for Camille. He was attacking his ability to be a man. He was showing Lucas that love requires infrastructure, and Lucas barely had a roof over his head. I love her, Lucas blurted out. It was a desperate, clumsy shield against Julian's precision strikes. Julian laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. Love, you think this is love? You're a vacation, Lucas. You're a hostel she visited because she was bored with the palace. But vacations end. And guests have to check out. He gestured to the restaurant around them with his knife. Look around you. This wine is $300 a bottle. That dress she's wearing cost more than your car. You think you can maintain her? You think you can keep her warm? Julian leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more violence than a scream. You're not a load-bearing wall, son. You're dry rot. Camille looked at Lucas. She wanted him to fight back, to flip the table, to scream that money didn't matter. But she saw the light die in his eyes. She saw the shame. Julian hadn't just insulted him. He had dismantled him. Eat your steak, Julian commanded softly, returning to his meal. I paid for it. It would be a shame to waste it.
Can we just talk about what just happened? Julian is terrifying here. He didn't throw a punch, he threw words. By calling Lucas a foreign element and dry rot, he isn't just insulting him, he is dehumanizing him. He's treating this affair like a structural error in a building, not a heartbreak. It's a power play to show that Lucas is beneath him. What scares you more, a partner who screams in rage or one who stays icy calm? Like Julian.
Julian placed his knife and fork parallel on his plate at the 4 o'clock position, the universal signal that a meal and perhaps a conversation was finished. He dabbed the corners of his mouth with the linen napkin, staring at the red stain of the wine on the white cloth. You're wondering how I found you, Julian said. It wasn't a question. He was answering the terror vibrating in Camille's eyes. I thought you were in London. Camille whispered, her voice barely audible over the clatter of silverware from the surrounding tables. I never went to London, Julian admitted smoothly. And I didn't hire a private investigator, if that's what you're thinking. That would be vulgar. I simply paid attention. He leaned back, interlacing his fingers. I've known since November, since you started buying that cheap hazelnut creamer for the house. You hate hazelnut, Camille, but he likes it. He nodded toward Lucas. And the mileage on the Range Rover. The erratic withdrawals of cash, small amounts untraceable. You were trying to build a secret life inside a glass house. It was amateurish. Camille felt a wave of nausea. He had watched her for 4 months. Every lie she told, every stolen hour, every moment of guilt, he had collected them all, cataloging them, like receipts waiting for the moment of maximum leverage. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why did you let it go on?" "Because I wanted to see if it would burn itself out," Julian replied coldly. "I treated it like a fever. I waited for the fever to break. But it seems the infection is persistent." He reached into his inner jacket pocket again. This time he didn't produce a receipt. He pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with the wax emblem of the St. James Foundation. He slid it across the table past the candle until it rested directly in front of Lucas. Lucas looked down at it, then up at Julian, confusion warring with fear. "What is this?" "An exit strategy," Julian said. "Open it." Lucas hesitated, his hands shaking as he broke the seal. He pulled out a heavy document. Camille saw the header, the St. James Architectural and Arts Fellowship. "It's a fully funded writer's residency," Julian explained, his voice taking on the tone of a benevolent benefactor. "In Rome. 2 years. Housing, a generous stipend, and introductions to every major publishing house in Europe. It's the kind of opportunity that turns a starving artist into a career author." Lucas stared at the paper. Camille saw his eyes scanning the numbers. The stipend was likely more than he would make in 10 years. "There is, of course, a condition," Julian added softly. "The flight leaves tonight at 11 p.m. A car is waiting outside to take you to Logan Airport right now." The silence that followed was absolute. The restaurant noise seemed to drop away. "You're trying to buy me off," Lucas said, but his voice lacked the fire it had earlier. He was looking at the paper. He was looking at the dream he had told Camille about in bed. The dream of writing in Italy, of being someone. "I am investing in talent," Julian corrected him. "And I am removing a structural liability from my marriage. It's a transaction, Lucas. Pure and simple." Julian turned to Camille, his eyes dead cold. "This is the test, Camille. You think he loves you. You think this is a grand romance. Watch carefully. Every man has a price. I'm just the one who can afford to pay it." He looked back at Lucas. "The car is a black sedan. You have 3 minutes to decide. Take the envelope and the life you always wanted, or stay here with a woman accustomed to a lifestyle you can never provide and watch her resent you for it within 6 months." Camille looked at Lucas. She willed him to throw the paper in Julian's face. She willed him to choose her. But she saw his hand tighten around the envelope. She saw the calculation behind his eyes. The same calculation she had seen in Julian 1,000 times. Julian checked his watch. 2 minutes, Mr. Scott." The silence that stretched across the table was heavier than the marble beneath their plates. It was a physical weight pressing down on Camille's chest, squeezing the air from her lungs until she felt lightheaded. She watched Lucas. She watched the man who had whispered poetry against her skin in the dark, the man who claimed to see her soul. He was staring at the envelope. His thumb caressed the heavy, cream-colored paper. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at Rome. He was looking at a future where he didn't have to worry about rent, where he was a celebrated author, not a struggling boy in love with a married woman. His hesitation was the answer. It didn't take him a minute. It took him 10 seconds. In those 10 seconds, Camille saw the death of their romance. It wasn't a tragedy. It was a transaction. Julian was right. Lucas was a tourist in her life, and his visa had just expired. Julian saw it too. A small, satisfied smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He picked up his wine glass, swirling the dark liquid. He had won. He had proven that money and power were the only real structural forces in the world, and love was just decoration. "Go," Camille said. The word was soft but it cut through the silence like a dropped glass. Lucas snapped his head up, guilt flooding his eyes. "Camille, Go to Rome, Lucas," she said, her voice steadying, hardening. She felt a strange, cold clarity washing over her. "Take the money. Write the book. It's a good ending for you." "I can't just leave you with him," Lucas stammered, but his hand tightened around the envelope. He was already leaving. His body was angling toward the door. "You already have," she said. Julian chuckled, a low, victorious sound. "See, darling, I told you. He's a smart boy. Now why don't we finish our wine and—" "You didn't win, Julian," Camille interrupted. She turned her gaze to her husband. For the first time in 8 years, she didn't see an architect or a god. She saw a small, terrified man who needed to control everything because he couldn't feel anything. Julian's smile faltered. "I beg your pardon. You think you bought my loyalty back?" Camille stood up. Her legs were shaking, but her chin was high. The movement drew the attention of the nearby tables. "You think because you proved he's weak that makes you strong?" "Sit down, Camille," Julian hissed, his eyes darting to the other diners. "You're making a scene." "I am the scene," she said, her voice rising, finding the volume she had suppressed for a decade. "You treated me like a property asset. You tracked me. You stalked me. You bribed a child to leave town. You think that makes me want to come home to you?" "I did what was necessary to protect this family." Julian snapped, his veneer cracking. "There is no family," Camille said. She reached for her left hand. The diamond ring, 3 carats, flawless cold, slid off her finger with ease. It clattered onto the china plate, spinning noisily before settling next to the untouched Dover sole. "I slept with him, Julian," she said clearly. The couple at the next table gasped. The waiter froze in his tracks. "I slept with him not because I loved him, but because I needed to feel something other than the cold you radiate. And now I don't need him. And I certainly don't need you." She looked at Lucas one last time. He looked small, clutching his envelope like a shield. She looked at Julian, who was staring at the ring on the plate, with a look of utter horror, not at the loss of his wife, but at the public display of failure. "Enjoy the check, gentlemen," Camille said. She turned and walked away. She didn't run. She walked past the hostess stand, past the heavy velvet curtains, and out into the lobby. She left the debris of her life behind her. The husband who owned her, the lover who sold her, and pushed open the heavy brass doors of the hotel. The heavy brass doors of the Archer Hotel swung shut behind her, cutting off the warmth, the jazz, and the wreckage of her life. Boston greeted her with a sheet of freezing rain. It soaked through her silk blouse, instantly plastering the fabric to her skin, chilling her to the bone. Camille didn't care. For the first time in 8 years, the cold felt real. It wasn't the air-conditioned chill of the St. James townhouse or the emotional frost of her marriage. It was just rain. Wet, messy, uncontrollable rain. She walked to the curb, her heels clicking on the wet pavement. She expected to hear footsteps behind her. Part of her, the part conditioned by a decade of Julian's possessiveness, expected him to storm out to grab her arm, to demand she get in the car and stop embarrassing him. Another part, the foolish romantic part, hoped Lucas would burst through the doors, tearing up the envelope, choosing her over Rome. She stopped at the edge of the sidewalk and waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 30. The doors remained closed. Camille let out a shaky breath that turned into a small, jagged laugh. Of course they didn't come. Julian was likely settling the bill, ensuring the waiter was tipped heavily enough to buy his silence. He was damage control in a suit. And Lucas, Lucas was probably already calculating the exchange rate of the euro, convincing himself that leaving was the noble choice, that he was doing this for her. They were both architects of their own fantasies, and she had just walked off their blueprints. She looked down at her left hand. The pale band of skin, where the diamond had sat for 8 years, looked raw, exposed. It felt lighter, as if she had severed a shackle. She had lost her home. She had likely lost her job at Hartwell, given Julian's influence on the board. She had no plan, no luggage, and nowhere to go. The panic should have been overwhelming. Instead, she felt a strange, vibrating stillness. It was the calm of a building after the demolition charges have gone off, when the dust finally settles and you can see the sky again. She raised her wrist to check the time on her slender Cartier watch, the last remnant of her old life. 9:15 p.m. Usually at this exact minute she would be sitting in the library waiting for Julian to finish his calls, pouring him a scotch, erasing herself so he could have peace. She stared at the dial. The second hand swept past the 12. Time kept moving. The world hadn't ended because she stopped playing her part. A yellow taxi hissed by on the wet asphalt, its vacant light glowing like a beacon in the gloom. Camille raised her hand. It wasn't a hesitant wave. It was a command. The cab screeched to a halt in front of her. She opened the door and slid into the worn leather seat. It smelled of stale pine air freshener and old cigarettes, a far cry from the lavender and leather of Julian's Mercedes. It smelled fantastic. "Where to, lady?" the driver asked, eyeing her soaked clothes and the mascara running down her cheeks in the rearview mirror. Camille looked out the window. She could see the silhouette of the Archer Hotel looming above her, a fortress of secrets and lies. She thought about Lucas holding his check. She thought about Julian holding his pride. "Just drive," Camille said, leaning her head back against the seat. "Drive north. Anywhere but here." As the taxi pulled away, merging into the stream of taillights bleeding red onto the wet street, Camille didn't look back. She didn't cry for the marriage she lost or the lover she never really had. She watched the city blur past her window, finally understanding why Lucas had come into her life. He wasn't the destination. He was just the exit door. She whispered the truth to the empty cab, a final benediction for the girl she used to be. Some loves aren't meant to be kept. They are meant to wake you up.
Camille walked away from both men that night. And honestly, it was a bitter victory, but it was hers. Sometimes we search for a savior in someone else only to realize we have to save ourselves. She lost her marriage and her lover, but she found her voice again. What about you? If you were in her shoes, would you have walked into the rain alone or tried to fix the marriage? Let me know in the comments. If this story touched you, please leave a like and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Take care of your heart, and I'll see you in the next one.